The DBMK Sea Fury is a brand new super kit for 2026, and what we've seen inside the box certainly seems to be quite impressive. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes. Join me on the workbench today as I start the build of this Supersize Sea Fury. In this first episode, I'm going to be focusing on building up the cockpit of this kit. So I'll be looking at what the parts I like to build, and sharing some of my thoughts as I progress through this project. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit to check out the various aspects which are included, such as the instructions, paint schemes, decals and plastic parts, I've already created a dedicated unboxing video on that topic. But without any further ado, let's get a list of the products I used in this particular section of the build on the screen here to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy replicating what you see in these steps. As usual, my first step will be to cut the parts from the sprue using my cutters or carefully removing them with a sharp knife. There isn't really anything in the way of flash, there is only a hint of it in a few places, so cleanup is fairly minimal, although you do have to make sure to clean up the sprue gates where it was holding it onto the runners. Because this is a mixed media kit and features photo etch as well as plastic parts, I thought that it would be a good idea to try and use these elements as much as I can. The control panel has some lovely moulded detail on it, and you could apply decals to this, which are also included. However, because I'm going to use the photo etch, sadly I have to sand all of this detail off back to a smooth surface. The photo etch would be carefully cut away from its fret with a sharp knife. Any little burrs could be carefully sanded down. The photo etch does come included in the kit and is manufactured by Eduard. This sheet is pre-printed, but there is a second sheet which is just left in bare metal. To attach the photo etch parts, I'm going to use some super glue for this. So the control panel gets built up in a number of parts, with the main backing part being glued onto the plastic part, which I have carefully removed all of the detail from. And then there are a number of other parts which build up the control panel and give representations of dials. There are a couple of little holes at the top of the control panel for mounting the reflector gun sight shortly, so I did try and reopen these to make sure that I could mount it. And at this point I'm going to use some black paint. The majority of the interior of this cockpit is black, and I would carefully paint this by hand onto the plastic parts surrounding the photo etch. This kit does lend itself to being built up in a number of sub-assemblies. Normally I would glue everything together and then paint it. However, because we've got pre-printed photo etch, I'm kind of having to do it this way. There were some details which, when sanded away, were completely removed. To replicate these, I'm pretty sure there's some kind of buttons. I cut the ends of some cocktail stick and glued them into position. I would again paint these black, just to give the impression that they are here. Some Vallejo gloss varnish would be carefully applied to all of the dials. I would let it pool inside of the cutouts, taking care to avoid getting it anywhere else. This is going to help replicate any glass that might be fronting the dials. And now I can start gluing some plastic parts together. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice, and as mentioned there is a reflector gun sight. This comes in a number of small parts which must be glued together. I would say take your time with this project because there are lots of fine little details which need to go in various places. Having assembled the majority of the gun sight, it would have been painted black, and then there are some photo etch elements which can be glued onto this as well. Some clear film is provided for the reflectors of this gun sight, and these were cut to shape. To hold the clear film, you need to sandwich it between two pieces of photo etch. As you can imagine, this was incredibly fiddly, and I did have to complete this part off camera due to the tiny size of these components. But once I'd done that, these pieces of clear film could be superglued into the correct positions on the gyroscope gun sight. And with that done, and now all cured, The gun sight could be mounted into those holes that I had to reopen a little bit earlier on. Turning my attention to the control panels on the side of the fuselage walls, once again there are a number of photo etch elements which can be installed here. If you didn't want to install the photo etch in this kit, you don't really have to, but of course it might be a little noticeable in places if some dials and things are not present. Some parts though are not represented as photo etch and are instead in the more traditional plastic. This was a little easier to complete. The side walls of the cockpit come nicely moulded with a good level of detail, and these control panels I've just completed could be glued into place. The fit of the part so far has been really quite good. However, I would say just make sure you test fit things because the tolerances are quite tight. Some extra details can be added onto here, and again there are some which have had some photo etch attached to them. So actually building up the cockpit was quite a time-consuming process. I did do a quick scan over the instructions, and by the time you've assembled the cockpit to the point I get it complete to in this video, you will have used about 80 parts from the kit, being a mix of plastic and photo etch. There are some fine details in plastic as well, such as these pipes, which I had to take a little bit of care to get in the correct places. They may need a little persuasion to just sort of bend around certain elements, but they are designed generally quite well. With the attachment of all of these small details, I've effectively created a couple more sub-assemblies, and then once again these were given a couple of thin coats of the Army Painter black paint. I'm going straight onto bare plastic with this paint and just building it up as neatly as I can. I didn't see the need to apply any primer because this is a low traffic area once it's been assembled, and I shouldn't run the risk of removing any paint because I won't be handling it after I've installed it inside of the aircraft. I decided to hand paint these elements as well to try and preserve those pre-printed photo etch parts. If I do get any paint in the wrong place though, I could pick out the tops of the handles with a suitable colour. The pilot's seat comes in a number of components as well. Once again, the design is pretty good and the parts fit together quite nicely. After a lick of paint, some pre-painted seat belts would be super glued onto the bottom of this seat. It might have been a little easier to fold them to a more appropriate shape rather than trying to fold them over the seat whilst in place. They did have a tendency to want to spring back, but I think after a little persuasion I got them where I needed them to go. With that done, I started to build up the different elements on the bulkhead behind the pilot's seat. There are some details which need to be glued in here. And then this kind of bracket can be attached to the floor of the cockpit, and the rear bulkhead I've just completed could be attached to this. Once again, I would say just take your time to make sure you get the alignment of things here as accurate as you can, so that it will fit nice and snug inside of the fuselage later on. The control column was glued into position, and then this other component followed it. The rudder pedals are assembled in a number of parts as well, and again there is a little bit of photo etch which can be included here. These rudder pedals were then installed onto their mounting point. The front firewall can then be added as well, once again making sure to get the alignment as neatly as possible so that it fits inside of the fuselage in a little bit. Because this one doesn't feature any photo etch, I decided that I would get out the matte black primer from Army Painter and simply rattle can this entire part. This just was quicker than painting it by hand. With that done, I thought it would be a good idea to install the pilot's seat, but actually, future me talking, don't do this here, because there's something I've forgotten and I'll swing back to that in a minute. The control panel can be glued into position in front of the control column, and it was at this point, despite being quite happy with my progress, I realised I'd forgotten something. So I very carefully removed the pilot's seat so that I could attach the photo etch seat belts behind it. So these get glued into two little slots on the rear bulkhead, having passed them already through some of the details which are present. And once these have been glued in place, I could reattach the pilot's seat. This is a better way of doing it because it allows you to then fold the seat belts over the seat and glue them in position. That's not an error On the instructions, that's just me jumping ahead and not paying attention. Before I close up the cockpit completely, I'm going to use this Humbrol number 1 Primer Grey to do a bit of dry brushing. Having loaded this paint onto my brush and then removed it all again, the brush now feels quite dry, and I would use the residue on the brush to pick out all of the highlighted details. This is a simple technique which just adds some further contrast and a little bit of highlighting. I would go a little heavier in some places, such as on the floor of the cockpit, just to make it look a little more worn. After this, some Humbrol 62, which is a leather colour, would be carefully painted onto the headrest. This is probably not particularly accurate, but I thought I would do it just for a little bit of visual interest and break up the monotony of the colour inside of the cockpit. The sidewalls can then be carefully attached, and again, just make sure you take your time here. The tolerances are quite tight, but provided you've got everything in the correct places, there is a point where these things will just kind of snap into position and be seated correctly. So with both sidewalls now attached, it is a little bit disappointing that all this lovely detail is a little bit more trickier to see, but at least we know that we've done it. Before I finish this part of the build, I'm just going to attach together a couple of components which go behind the pilot's backrest, and these parts could then be attached to said backrest. Again, if you've built the model correctly, these things will slot into place and look quite natural. The final step in this part of the build is to attach this inside one of the fuselage halves. Once again, take your time here to try and get everything aligned as neatly as possible, and I would allow the cement to run between the joins, being drawn in through capillary action to help create a strong bond. And with that, I'm going to call my first part of the DBMK Sea Fury FB.11 in 1/32 scale complete. So a little bit of a summary on this part of the build. I think the thing to take away is that this is a big project. It is a bit of a time sink. And whilst the parts are designed to a lovely quality, the moulding is really quite nice with only a hint of flash in a few places. The fit of the parts is really good, although check those tolerances because they could be a little bit tight if you've done something a little bit wrong previous in the build. I just think this is a project that you just need to take your time over. You are kind of forced to slow down a little bit. This kit has 10 plastic sprues, and slightly annoyingly, I found that just to build the cockpit, the parts that I needed were found on 7 of the 10 sprues. Some companies will put their plastic parts for different sections of the build, such as the landing gear, the cockpit, the wings, etc. Those set areas of the build will be featured on one sprue so that you effectively complete a sprue and don't have to go digging around. I did find that this took me just over a day just to do this cockpit, because I was kind of slowed down a little bit by playing Hunt the Part. I completely appreciate that some companies may put parts in different places on different sprues in order to make it more efficient to save space and thus keep costs down. But it's a part of this build that I find a little bit frustrating. It is only a minor complaint though, and doesn't really detract from the quality of the kit. However, I would point out one small thing. I did notice that there were 2 photo etch parts listed as A23, and you only actually get one part A23 included on the sheet. So this did throw me a little bit, but I actually think that the one at step 5 should be part 17. So it's just a typo, but just be aware of it if you are building this kit. Well, that's it for part 1, where I finished the cockpit. In the next episode, I should be exploring the landing gear bays. So make sure you stay tuned for that one. Don't forget that we do have a Model Minutes Model Club, and if you'd like to join the Model Club, check out the links in the description. Massive thanks to these guys on screen for the extra support they give the channel. And if you'd like to join them and get exclusive access to early videos and other perks, full information is below the video. There are other ways to help support the channel if you'd prefer, but the best way to support the channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.